This is Scaling Corporate Accountability, humans and AI together in the fight to #end slavery. And shortly I'm going to pass the mic to the next session's chair, Laureen Van Breen, who's the Managing Director at WikiRate. Now, WikiRate is an open data platform powered by a diverse community that collects, analyses and shares data on company commitments, actions and impacts on people and the planet. And this discussion will explore the opportunities and challenges of developing an AI algorithm to scale corporate accountability in this area. So, over to you, Laureen.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. We're so happy to see so many of you here and online as well. I'm joined by a very excellent panel, so my job is going to be very easy today. I'm going to give you a quick overview of how the session is going to flow, and then, we'll dive right in. So we're going to start with a brief introduction from my side on the topic, followed by the introductions from the three panelists, and then we'll have the bulk of the time for questions. So I have some questions for the panelists, of course, but I would love to also hear your questions, so very warm welcome to send your questions through. It would be great if you want to direct your question to one of the speakers directly, please do say so in the question itself. So then maybe let's start by defining modern slavery and set us all off on the same foot. You've probably heard about it so many times already at this conference, but I thought, let's ask ChatGPT. So in simple terms, this is what he, she, it told me. In simple terms, modern slavery refers to situations where people are forced to work, usually for little or no pay, and are unable to leave or control their own lives. It can take many different forms and affects people of all ages, genders, and backgrounds. It is a serious violation of human rights that is recognized as a major global issue. Now, AI and ChatGPT, of course, holds a lot of promise, not without its challenges. But AI is often considered a silver bullet, especially in the sectors where we work with civil society. It is this magic thing. Whenever they have a tech or data problem, they will come to us and say, isn't there some tool out there for this? Or, can't we do some magic here? And so this idea of the silver bullet really comes from the people who don't actually work or develop these tools. And so one of the things that we spend quite a bit of time on is explaining the challenges as well of these tools. There's, as many of you will know, plenty of examples of biases and mistakes. A very famous example within the corporate space is Amazon's hiring process where, the training data had a bias against women. So it's definite, it's something I wanted to stress here is that this panel doesn't subscribe to this idea of AI taking over our lives anytime soon. And so it's really, for us, about the interplay between these technological tools and human intelligence. And so that's actually really what this session wants to dive deeper into, a case study of that. Now, one point I want to then stress before I go to my excellent panelists is that this tool that we're discussing today is not actually a tool for identifying issues of modern slavery. It is a tool that helps us hold businesses to account when it comes to their policies and practices to find and address these issues. So that's just a good distinction to be aware of. And it's a tool that really helps governments and civil society to hold those businesses to account on their practices. So with that, I would like to go to my first panelist, Abby Monroe from Walk Free. Over to you.
Thanks, Laureen. Hi, everyone. Just by way of background, Walk Free is an international human rights group, and we work to eradicate all forms of modern slavery. And our ultimate goal requires the dismantling of systems, entrenched practices, and part of that is also business supply chains and legislative reform. So this project that we worked on really combines a few of our goals internally at Walk Free. And I thought it would be useful to talk about some of the legislation that we look at in this project. So both the UK and Australia have implemented modern slavery acts, where companies above a certain financial threshold have to report on actions that they have, or unfortunately more often have not, taken to respond to modern slavery in their supply chains. But a really important nuance here is that it is a reporting requirement, so it doesn't actually obligate those companies to take action, it just obligates them to report on their supply chains. So we need research at scale to hold companies to account. And the majority, we found, are falling at the first hurdle. So they're submitting statements that don't meet the minimum criteria for guidance on reporting. And for that minimum criteria is actually really low threshold, particularly for the UK Modern Slavery Act. And what it means in practice is that a company that's operating in a really high-risk modern slavery industry could submit a statement that said that they have absolutely no reason to believe that there's modern slavery in their supply chains. And as long as that statement was approved by the board, signed by the CEO, and appeared on the company website, that would be compliant with the law, which obviously is just not engaging with the essence of why this legislation is in place. The Australian Modern Slavery Act has gone a step further. It has mandatory reporting criteria. So companies have to report on things like modern slavery training, remediation processes, whistleblowing policies. So it gets more into the detail. But again, it doesn't get to the quality of those disclosures. It is just about, reporting. So for this reason, legislation in this area is only as effective in as far as it's meaningfully engaged with by companies, and it means that research and advocacy efforts like that we're doing in this project are really integral to understanding modern slavery risks at an industry by industry level, encouraging further engagement with legislation and providing transparency and driving standards. It also, research that we've done and the results that we've had brings into question the effectiveness of mandatory human rights disclosure that doesn't have any consequences for non-reporting or for substandard reporting. Ultimately, it makes the case for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, which actually holds companies accountable. It imposes a duty to protect as well as a duty to report. So we use the data gathered in this project to advocate for better disclosures by companies. Like I said, on an industry by industry basis, so really looking into what are the endemic modern slavery risks in a particular industry and encouraging companies to really engage with that meaningfully. And we also advocate directly with governments to improve current legislation that exists and to make the case for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Abby. Yeah, and it shows the shocking low bar and that companies fall so quickly just shows that really a big need for companies to feel watched, to take it more serious. Thank you. So then I would like to go to our second speaker, Aileen from WikiRate.
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the open data and crowd research side of this research. So along with Walk Free, we've done a lot of research on modern slavery statements through our platform, wikirate.org. So wikirate.org is an open data platform where we collate information about corporate sustainability. So the reason that we do this is that we believe that we are all stakeholders in companies. So actually companies affect all of our lives, all of your lives, every day. They operate in our community. We use and consume their products and services. And on top of that, they also really influence supply chains, communities, and the environment all across the world. And what we've seen is really this big proliferation of company reporting. So that's in response to legislation like the Modern Slavery Act, but then also just generally a greater move towards transparency by some companies who will now disclose environmental and social data in sustainability reports. But the key issue is that this data is not accessible at scale. it's not possible for people to actually be able to compare between companies. To find this information, you have to go onto a corporate website, find a PDF tucked away on some page. And so that means that it's a huge barrier for people to actually use and engage with this data. So what we've done is actually create a lot of research projects to bring standardized data about corporate sustainability into the open data space for everybody to be able to use and access for free. So in terms of this project, we worked with Walk Free, who wanted to understand better how companies were responding to the new Modern Slavery Act, which came out in 2015 in the UK. And subsequently, there have been also further acts in other countries like Australia. And we created a series of metrics that could actually measure both company compliance with the law, but then also go beyond compliance. So to see how are companies responding to risks in their supply chain, and what actions are they taking as well. And we worked with Columbia University to help revise these metrics. And since then, over the past 5-6 years, we've actually been working with a lot of volunteers and student groups who do essentially crowd research directly on WikiRate and extract data from these very text-heavy statements so that we can actually understand how companies are responding to these laws. And to date, we've assessed over 3,000 statements, but just to give a sense of scale, alone on the platform, we have over 25,000 statements. And beyond that, there are tens of thousands of statements now being produced every year. So of course, we would love to know what is in all of these statements, because as Abby said, it's really important to understand and hold companies to account for their policies on modern slavery. So that's really why we've worked with Adriana on this project. So I'll pass back to Lorraine to introduce her as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for giving us an overview of how we began that scaling journey. And then the wonderful Adriana came into our lives at the time still as a master level student who was working on this idea that she said, well, you were able to create a standardized data set and get humans to answer these questions. Surely I can get a computer to do that too. So with that introduction, I would like to hand over to our third panelist, Adriana.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm joining you from Australia. So before I start, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am conducting my research here at QUT, the Turrbal and Yugara people. We recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, researching, and learning. So as a quick background, I am joining you today in my capacity as a PhD candidate here at QUT, the Queensland University of Technology, and also I am the project lead of Project AIMS AI Against Modern Slavery at MILA, the Quebec Institute of Artificial Intelligence. But this project started many years ago, as Lorraine was pointing, while I was a student. So very much was inspired by all this work that Walk Free and WikiRate were already conducting on the statements that were published in the UK. And as I was doing this research, I was trying to see if I can apply some of the techniques that we are learning to use to scrape data from social media platforms and analyze and see if we can apply them on this purpose. So I started by applying some unsupervised machine learning called topic modeling and try to get all the themes that will be generated by putting all these statements together and analyze them. And I thought that that it's really already a step of progress. However, getting some feedback from Walk Free and WikiRate at that stage, realizing that while unsupervised learnings allow us to look at all the statements at the same time, what we really want to do is dive into each of the statements and look for this particular information that gives us an indication if the company is compliant or with the requirements of the legislation. So then in this first phase of the prototype, I built some of the more rule-based steps based on a set of keywords. And this, on its turn, ended up having limitation of being too restrictive, because even if we're able to look for the particular words for one of these metrics that were described, it was not able to capture of the variety in which a company can describe this metric. So we decided to build a partnership between Walk-Free, Wikirate, and the Future Society, which is a think tank with the mission of advancing the ethical governance of AI. And then we are hoping to scale this prototype. So this is when Project AIMS started. And in this first phase of Project AIMS, we're still looking at the UK statements. And we really wanted to see if we can expand this list of keywords and embed more of the expert knowledge in creating more expert heuristics, and then employ better methods to look for this information related to the metrics. And also we thought that there would be a great opportunity to leverage the data that already was collected on the Wikirate platform and try to treat it as a ground truth data for the machine learning algorithm. So we start building experiments, and what we realized from the beginning is that there were very many limitations with this project that would really affect the good quality AI result. So it started, as Eileen already presented, with data collection. We were not always able to access the links of the statements. Secondly, once we built a data set as good as we could, when we were trying to scribe the text from the PDFs, we're encountering many challenges, because most of the time those PDFs came in non-machine readable formats. They had partial or complete scan pages, and therefore, most of the time they had lots of infographics as well. So if you've ever tried to extract text from PDF, you know how many limitations this can create. So then we saw the potential of collecting all these learnings and together we published a paper in the AAAI journal where we really emphasize on these limitations of the data that then really stop us from building good AI solutions. And we put this forward as recommendations both for businesses and for government. And having this wonderful interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder collaboration on the project, as was presented, we had the opportunities to use these learnings and then feed them into the reviewing of the existing legislation or the consultation processes of the legislation that are now into the pipeline. Because we really want to be able to help governments visualize this data pipeline. So not only to require companies to publish, but also to think about how are they going to monitor all these statements that now are being published by companies, and think about how to facilitate the deployment of technological solutions for them to be aided in that monitoring and evaluation, and therefore make the documents machine readable and having them centralized on a registry, etc. Many more recommendations on this paper that we can point you to. So that was a fantastic first phase of this project. And then we decided that it would be really beneficial to really take this project on a second phase, a lot more research focused. So then this is when we started this partnership between QET and Mila. And we're really diving into the case study of the Australian Modern Slavery Act and looking at the Australian Modern Slavery Statement, because as was presented, it is a little bit stronger as a legislation. And also we're hoping to work closely with the Attorney General's Department here in Australia. So therefore we're working in a way, if we want to say, with the client in mind. So we really hope that all this research then can be translated in the future in a tool that can be deployed and really helping a governmental agency with the monitoring of this legislation.
Great, thank you so much, Adriana. That is an excellent overview of how this all got started and why we need that scale and why we really are focusing on it, but how hard it is that at the first hurdle, you often already run into very fundamental issues, and how fortunate we've been through this approach with the different organizations that we did have a way to communicate with the government and actually have them already put improvements in place so that we can, see what the next hurdle is where we get stuck. So thank you all three for those excellent introductions to the work that you've been doing on this project. So then I would like to move on to questions. I already have a few questions coming in from the audience, which I'll be covering as well. But maybe I can just start by asking you, Abby. So we've already heard a bit about the promise of AI, and Adriana started to touch on some of the challenges as well. So yeah, of course, it's a lot easier said than done, all of this. So I was wondering, can you talk us a little bit through more the challenges and the bottlenecks that we ran into? And was there anything really surprising there?
Yeah, so in terms of challenges, we found kind of three main focus areas, and those are access, format, and structure. So with access, obviously, data needs to be accessible for AI to identify, extract, and process. And we even find when we're creating our annual reports on these different industries, actually identifying which companies are in scope of the legislation in terms of their turnover, which legislation they're reporting under, what their company structure is, that can be a real sticking point for us, can't it, when we're making those lists of which companies are included. So having some kind of central registry where not only the statements existed, so that would kind of help with access, but also just who was in scope, so that when we're calling out companies and trying to hold companies accountable, it's clear which companies were meant to be in scope. So secondly, format. Adriana touched on this a bit. So there's no kind of uniform mandate across the legislation in terms of the format of statements. So there's no uniform electronic formatting. There's inconsistent and different approaches, which makes it quite difficult to apply kind of one tool across the board. And finally, structure. So again, it's around inconsistencies, and that can include something as simple as whether subtitles and subheadings are used, down to kind of the terminology. So without conventional terminology being applied across the board, it would be difficult to teach an AI system exactly what to look out for. There's also differences in the terminology used within the modern slavery kind of umbrella. It's an umbrella term, so within that there are different specifics that are really quite nuanced that we come up against when we're doing this manually. So yeah, those are kind of the three main areas.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down. And I think that one of the things that I just wanted to pick up on is that this is a question that we also get a lot in the work with WikiRate is, a company, how is it defined? I think if I say Coca-Cola, we all think of the one, but there's hundreds of entities. And especially when it comes to this legal kind of reporting, it matters which entity that's tied to. So if a company is not actually telling you, it becomes incredibly hard to know who am I looking at, where do I need to look for these documents and things like that. So yes, thank you for highlighting that. So then maybe coming back to you, Adriana, can you explain a bit more about what AI techniques the project is using? Are there any other infamous or famous AI tools that are using similar or same techniques?
Sure. So throughout the development of Project AIMS, we've been exploring with a variety of methods. So as I mentioned in the master thesis prototype, I use structured topic modeling. It's an unsupervised method of analysis. And then when we dived into the scaling with the partners in this first phase of Project AIMS, we started first to look at labeling functions using the snorkeling framework, because in fact, what we realized, as you all know, working with AI, the quality of the annotated data is extremely important if you're thinking to use supervised learning. And while the data from WikiRate was a great start, because it was not initially designed with the purpose of being used for an AI tool, we were encountering limitation in that regard. So then we were hoping that the snorkeling framework would provide us with an opportunity opportunity to create automatically more labeled data. And then when we try to analyze the metrics, we looked at a combination initially of rule-based and random forest approach. Secondly, we looked at the hierarchical attention network here. To take a step back with this project, we're not only looking at classifying statements per one criteria, saying, yes, this statement is sign, or this statement talks about supply chain. We also want to present the snippet of text or the paragraph that justifies that classification or justifies the decision that the algorithm made. So we know, when already was discussed in the earlier panel, how important it is to be able to explain the decisions of algorithms, for especially when you're deploying it in such an important context. So this was an initial exploration for that particular purpose, but we will explore more. And then we also look at some transformers. Well, what happened at the end of the phase one? So all these experiments are available. We have run a really in-depth project evaluation together with Mila team. And this evaluation took place at the end of 2021. And as you know, 1 year in NLP development is like 10 in other fields. And there's no point of me extending further, considering where we're at today with the big language models. So what we are doing right now is we are updating that project review, and we're conducting the literature review. And we want to bring that to an updated version to look at the state of the art today on that. But we still really believe that there is huge value in doing supervised learning, and therefore we're really focusing on data annotation, but also on semi-supervised. So what I mean here by semi-supervised is something in the direction of label topic modeling or label LDA, which means that we still want to be able to build upon the direction of and the precision of supervised learning, really looking for what the ground truth is telling us, and then combine that with the opportunity to capture all that we couldn't have predicted, and all that variety of in which a company can describe the same metric, and all this limitation that Abby was presenting about language. So we still see value in that, applying unsupervised learning to do that. So that's one area. And then we really believe that we will rely still on transformers and on transfer learning. The reason why we are looking in transfer learning is because our label data set at this moment is very limited. We only have about 5,000 statements in Australia at the moment that are not scanned. We're making a stand. We're not going to analyze scanned documents. So we're going to use that still to advocate for machine readability. So we predict around only 5,000 statements to be available to be labeled. So therefore our ground truth is quite small. We need to leverage some transfer learning in that regard. But what I want to say also is that there is, in terms of other work that exists, there is a lot of inspiration generally from applying AI in the legal systems. Only, I think this week, Law Tech UK published a case study showcasing 12 leading businesses that are deploying machine learning in the legal services. So we're really looking closely at that because there is a lot developing in that field. But in terms of really people applying machine learning or quantitative analysis on these particular statements on corporate reporting on modern slavery or due diligence legislation, we believe that we are leading that work. We see that there are publications being published now, but they're all still deploying unsupervised machine learning, the topic modeling, which is still quite a bit of a low-hanging fruit at this moment. So we are hoping that we'll see more research in the area. And finally, just to point that we know that there are businesses out there that are helping companies with their reporting, and they're claiming that in that phase, they're also deploying AI to analyze these statements. But of course, because this is their business model, they're not making their methodology available. But so we were unable to include that in our review of the methods. But we know that at least they're claiming they're doing that. So this is a bit of an overview of what we've done and what we are looking at the moment. And this is a great opportunity to say to the public and the audience of AI researchers, if you know of anything else that I haven't mentioned, please let me know, because this is the perfect time to include it in our review.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adriana. And I think you also again touched on a really crucial point there of the volume of statements and data that we have to work with. And one thing there that has at least made an impression on me was one of the key things in these documents that you want to find out about is, did the company find any cases of modern slavery in their supply chain? And especially in the first years, we were seeing less than 2% of companies reporting this. And it's now slowly going up as they're starting to talk about case studies of mostly partners. But it's about 8%, right? So it's such a low amount that it becomes really hard for an AI tool to know what is exactly that it's looking for. So these are also challenges that we were coming across, that the most important data sometimes you don't really have a good ground truth data set. So then I would like to go to a question from the audience, from Laura. She asks, human trafficking has been identified in 27 of the 32 local authorities across Scotland. I'm going to direct this to you, Abby, but I'll finish the question first. How can we scale awareness of accountability to small and medium enterprises, learning from larger companies, needing to comply with these modern slavery statements?
That's a really interesting question. I think this is where, within the project, we really look at the importance of industry initiatives. So companies of small, medium, and large sizes within that industry coming together, sharing good practice. I was talking a bit earlier about industry-specific risks. Those risks will still be present whether the company is small or very large. It will just be at a different scale, obviously. But having an awareness and sharing that good practice, I think, is something we really encourage with the project, and we really use the data and the kind of shortcomings of how companies are currently responding to advocate for whole industry-wide change and an increase in awareness of what those risks are, so that companies can engage more meaningfully.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, and maybe just to tag on, it might seem like a little bit of a pivot, but I think there's some relation there. Is a question from Tom, which I think I'll direct to you, Abby, as well, but maybe also Adriana, you might have something to chime in as well. He asks, although the reporting requirements of the Modern Slavery Act hopefully introduce incentives for the private sector to fight modern slavery, do you think there's more that AI could help governments and NGOs directly to change the conditions that lead to modern slavery? Is there more that AI could do? Now, I have an idea, but if you want, I can also take it. Or Adriana, maybe you also, I know you have been looking also at migration in relation to the Ukrainian conflict and migration streams, and how that actually increases chances, of course, of exploitation as well.
Sure. So I think that's, thank you for that lead, Lauren, because to answer very briefly that question, I would say that there is a lot of very fascinating research happening in this overarching AI for good and AI for the sustainable development, or whatever framework that is really looking at using this technology to really accelerate the work that we're doing for preventing people to fall victims of different vulnerabilities. So I think it comes back to the definition of modern slavery and the causes, which is related to the level of vulnerability of a person. So that can be caused either by poverty, climate change-induced migration, war-induced migration, or any other type of vulnerability. So then if you are looking for one of those causes, and then you're looking what are the most interesting developments with AI in that field, I reckon that would be a fantastic way to start building an idea of the different initiatives that exist. But I know that there are many already out there, and I believe, however, that they have the same struggles that we do have in this project, which is getting quality data, and especially when you're working with vulnerable people and with a crime, which is often undercover, so therefore extremely hard to measure and extremely hard to collect data for. But I'll just stop here for a second.
Great, thank you, Adriana. Yeah, and maybe just the other project that comes to mind for me is from another organization working on modern slavery. It's the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. They work with a proprietary data set, so that is outside the purview of what we're doing. But they've been using tax crime data. So they're using other data sets as a proxy. So having petty crimes that can lead to then, for instance, a factory owner not being able to pay taxes or trying to avoid taxes. That could be the gateway to then having other crimes, like, for instance, not paying your workforce or, these kinds of other practices. So they've been using those kinds of proxy data sets, which is a quite interesting project as well. So it's worth reaching out to them if you are wanting to hear more about that. Yeah, of course.
I thought it was worth mentioning that also Walk Free are the producers of the world's leading data set on the number of people living in modern slavery worldwide. It's called the Global Slavery Index, and the latest edition is being published in May. So that piece really looks at what those underlying vulnerabilities are. It provides estimates at the global, national and regional level of the number of people living in modern slavery, what type of modern slavery that is, and those underlying vulnerabilities. So what we see in that is that there are just so many intersectionalities of where vulnerability and risk intersect with other areas of vulnerability and risk that aren't necessarily falling under that modern slavery umbrella. So some of the wider things that Adriana mentioned, like poverty, climate change, crisis, conflict. So yeah, any work that is addressing vulnerabilities is by proxy helping in the fight against modern slavery.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Maybe then to come to you, Aileen. As the title of the session goes, it's humans and AI together against, in the fight to end slavery. So where do the humans really come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked a bit about the kind of research that we've done, the crowd research with people working to extract the data from the statements. And I think it's worth mentioning kind of what the form of those statements are. So a modern slavery statement tends to be a very long piece of text, essentially, with paragraphs and headings. So obviously that creates a lot of challenges when you're trying to use AI to extract that information. And I think the way that we see how AI can help with this project is to really target those indicators or metrics which are easier for the AI to be able to extract the data. So some of those metrics on legal compliance, such as whether the statement has board approval, who has signed the statement, which are really important metrics because this is about who has responsibility for this statement. So if the statement contains an inaccuracy, those members of the board would hold responsibility for that. But obviously for a researcher, you can imagine it's quite mind-numbing to go through hundreds, maybe thousands of statements looking to see whether or not it has board approval. And what we really want to do is be able to target those amazing brains that the researchers have towards those thornier topics, because there are always questions that even among ourselves, when we're trying to extract the data, that we have lots of conversations about certain data points and maybe there are disagreements. And that's really because of the type of language used in the statements. It's very legal. We're talking about very complex questions about risk and accountability. So we're really looking at it as a way to kind of target the human resources in a way towards those more tricky questions, and then to be able to kind of complement that with the AI being able to extract some of those other types of indicators which might be easier for the AI to kind of analyze. And of course, with our data, since it's crowd research, we have a lot of verification anyway. So as we look for every data point to have at least one, but to be honest with this project, we often have 3 pairs of eyes looking at every data point just to ensure the accuracy. And the source is always included, so you can go back and check whether that is an accurate representation. So in that case, we would also then have potentially humans on the verification level, so that we can also spot check the accuracy as the project continues as well.
Excellent, thank you so much. Yeah, and then maybe just to come to a question from Tom. I will direct this to you, and I can maybe chime in a little bit as well. But he says, Lorraine mentioned that companies have tended to only actually report instances of modern slavery as case studies with their partners. Could the Modern Slavery Act be updated to improve the incentives for companies to acknowledge problems in their own supply chains?
Yeah, we would like to see this, and I think one of the reasons we advocate for human rights due diligence legislation is that additional duty to protect. And I think with having that obligation included means that companies can't really be approaching it as a box-ticking exercise. They have to be more meaningfully engaging. In order to protect workers in supply chains, you really do need to do that additional layer of assessment, of identifying risk, of identifying incidents, and it's a stronger legislation to impose that. So yeah, I definitely think with this type of legislation becoming more popular, there's an EU-wide mandate now for, well, that hopefully will be being passed, for that to be introduced across the EU. A lot of countries already have it in place. So I think as we start to see that grow, we will see companies having no choice but to engage more meaningfully, and part of that engagement, I think, will be identifying actual incidences of modern slavery and, crucially, providing remediation.
Right, yes, absolutely. And I think maybe it's also good to keep in mind here that it's law, right? Mm-hmm. And that these companies do not operate just within the confines of this one jurisdiction. So you have an interplay of different legal frameworks here that a company is thinking about, and that their lawyers will be reviewing the statements with that in mind. So, for instance, in the US, it's very litigation heavy. If you would there report that you have a case of modern slavery, you could actually be held accountable. The board could be held accountable. And with some new legislation coming in the EU, it looks like if they are reporting these things as well, the more information is out there in the domain, the more likely they're also going to be exposed to litigation, which is relatively new in the EU. So there's a lot of worry. So companies, there's all these pressures that make companies more conservative in what they're telling us. But at the same time, we are seeing this encouraging increase of slowly seeing more and more incidents being reported. And I think one of the things that I always love about the work that Walk Free is doing is that they're really emphasizing if you have the right risk assessment framework, and if you've identified where the risks are highest in your supply chain, and you then monitor those risks, you will find those incidents. Mm. I mean, it's such an endemic issue that all of us sitting here in the room, anyone at home, our lives aren't possible without forced labor. That is the sad reality of the world that we live in. It's through your phones, through your mobile device, your computer, your clothes. Mm-hmm. Almost every product you own has been touched somewhere by someone who is being coerced to work for no to little pay. So I think this is something that we're always trying to emphasize, that if you're doing your due diligence right, you will find it. And so if you're not telling us, you either haven't done your job right, or you're hiding something. And then what else are you hiding, right? So these are the two kind of narratives that I think are very compelling as well for companies. Thank you. So then maybe coming to you, Aileen, as Project AIM shows how AI can be used to track corporate reporting, what other ways are there to work with open data and AI to hold companies accountable?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked a lot here about essentially company self-reporting. So a lot of the data we hold right now about companies are coming from the companies themselves. And this is really important information. But of course, we want to also bring in other voices. So we know that companies are impacting our environment and our communities around the world. And we need to understand better those impacts. So we're looking at some projects at the moment where we can actually use AI as a way to scale up and bring in more voices. So you might have, for instance, a watchdog or an activist group that works on the ground in a particular region. And they themselves see incidents of forced labor, or they may see incidents related to the environment, and they might report that publicly. But collecting all of that information from so many sources is a real challenge. And we actually have a project that we're doing a pilot of at the moment, which is on biodiversity. So in this case, we're working with a group, an organization in France called Mana Community, and they created an algorithm which looks at a certain number of sources that they have already kind of filtered to say that they are trustworthy. And it pulls in all of these reports from sources. It can be from social media, it could be from a news website, and they analyze those reports. They look for incidents of deforestation that are linked specifically to company supply chains. And the data that comes out of that, we can have researchers looking at that information and saying, okay, we have this many alerts linked to this company in this time period. And for us, this is a really important part of scaling corporate accountability, because you might have companies that are making those kind of claims. We have no modern slavery in our supply chain. We have no deforestation in our supply chain. And of course, we want to actually check if that is correct. And I think these groups, these other voices, are a really important part of doing that. So I think that's something that we're looking to in the future. And hopefully we'll have more AA projects and potentially even work with the MANA algorithm to kind of create a system where we can do that across many topics and not just deforestation as well.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so this kind of bringing in of other voices at scale as well, this kind of challenge. Maybe then to come to, just briefly jumping back to what we were just talking about with the different laws, we got in a question from Nick. Do the courts, given the different local laws, accept AI-powered or AI-assisted findings? And what are any challenges here? It's an excellent question. I'm not sure, Abby, if you have something to respond on that?
Not specifically on the AI piece,
Yeah.
Maybe Adriana.
Yeah, Adriana, if you have something to say, please chime in.
So what I like to say is that the way we are designing this algorithm is that we're only looking at what companies already published. It's already out there. And then if we are providing information that is then used in a court litigation case, it will be extremely easy to trace back and check in the original document, is what we're claiming true or not? So let's say we have said that a particular company has identified as many cases of slavery, and then somebody's using the information in the court. You can go to the original document and see if that information exists or not in there. I feel that that will be quite, for this particular type of project where we are only analyzing the documents that are public, AI should not really be an issue. What I can say is that the appetite of using AI in the legal system varies very much depending on the jurisdictions and the previous cases. But in this particular question, I don't think that the cases where actual businesses are brought to court are related to their modern slavery reporting, but rather to their due diligence. And that's where the legislation is strong enough for the parties to have the power to bring companies to the court. And that's mainly in the case of the French legislation, etc. And maybe we will see the first case in the UK soon, but so far we haven't really seen those legislation in the UK and Australia being able to move that far to have actually companies held accountable in the court.
Yeah, and maybe something to add there is that especially in the UK, what we were saying earlier, right, they're not even providing a list of all the companies they're expecting to report. And that's because they're worried what companies might do to them if they were falsely identifying a company that is actually not within the threshold, right? So the governments are treading very carefully here. And so, yeah, there's not, even though there's this idea that you could litigate, whether that actually happens is a whole nother question. Maybe I can pick up on that as well with Laura's question. How are you balancing with open work and the risk of working on this topic? presumably the opportunity to highlight accountability might also be accompanied by the risk of making more information available to perpetrators of human trafficking and modern slavery. So putting more information out there, laying out the rule book, does that really maybe also have adverse impacts? Do you want to maybe come to that, answer that question?
I think, as Adriana was saying, we're only analysing data that is publicly available at this point. So those risks kind of within this particular project aren't as present, I don't think. Obviously, in generally working in this space, there is, of course, a need to be very careful with identification of survivors that we work with of modern slavery, and yeah, being really careful around those kind of issues. But I think in this project, not so much because of the publicly available data.
Yeah, no, and I absolutely agree. And I think there's always this risk of when you spell out too well to companies what is expected of them, that they play the game, right? Mm-hmm. So there's always this kind of worry. And I think definitely on the government side, there is a risk of that. The government is quite lenient in how they interpret what due diligence might look like or how they could be reporting on something like that. Mm-hmm. But I think the Walk Free's interpretation of the guidance has taken that more strict approach of like, we want to see you actually engage with the material meaningfully. And so if the companies were to follow the rule book that Walk Free is laying out for them, if they played the game, we'd be very happy.
And I think we've spoken about before how risk is in this area is often seen as a risk to the company themselves, or like an operational risk, rather than how it should be framed as a human rights risk. So this is a risk of real people being exploited. Our latest statistics show that there's 50 million people in the world living in modern slavery. So the legislation is to protect those 50 million people, not to protect companies and their operations. But we do often see that the way companies engage with the legislation and the way they uptake certain reporting disclosures is to protect themselves, which is very disappointing. But
yeah, thank you.
If I might add briefly to that, just to say that if we take a step back and look at this question from the point of if we're just providing more information to perpetrators, I would like to point out that in this work against modern slavery, it's quite generally acknowledged that, in fact, the perpetrators are a few steps ahead, and they not only using technology to commit crimes, but also they know very well how to exploit the vulnerabilities. They're very well established routes of trafficking and entire systems of trafficking. What we're about to start doing finally, it is for us and the law enforcement and the civic society to start to unveil some of this. So we need to make this data open. So we are playing at this moment still very much a catch-up game with them. And then hopefully once we are bringing the power of the private sector, which is huge through the power of their supply chain, into this work through this type of legislation, this is when I feel like finally we will have potential to not only catch up with these really old systems of abuse that keep innovating themselves, but rather hopefully take a step ahead and start seeing the numbers decrease, because as the global slavery shows us, the additional this year compared to 2017 is that the number of people that are enslaved increased by 10 million, if I'm correct, Abby. So we don't like these statistics, and that showcases this unfortunate balance between the trafficking systems and where we are at, all the other stakeholders working against it.
Great. Yes, thank you for that, Adriana. There's still some really excellent questions, and I really am so grateful for all the questions that you've posed. I'm, however, going to have to start to move into some final questions that I have for the panelists. That doesn't mean we don't want to answer your questions, so please come find us afterward as well if there is more that you want to talk about. But so maybe just to close up, I would like to come to you, Adriana, maybe with two questions. One being, if I'm sitting in the audience and I want to use the work that, that Project AIMS is doing, is there a place where I could access it? Is there something I could use there?
Yeah, sure. So we made all the first phase of Project AIMS open source on GitHub. So if you're just Googling the Future Society Project AIMS in GitHub, it's going to pop up for sure. So that's where you're going to find all the details about all the different experiments we've done, but also you can find my details there. And I'm really looking forward to receiving more questions from you if you have any. And also if you're a student or if you're interested in collaborating in this project, really open to brainstorm on ways in which we can reshape this project for your interest, so you can do something that you like, but also help us progress with the project. And we had there are a few examples there of some previous students that we work with, but also people that are just looking to volunteer and put their extra time into a good cause project. So the Future Society Project AIMS GitHub.
Great, thank you so much. And then my last question to you is, what's next for Project AIMS?
So next, short-term data annotation. We're really excited to really to be able to partner again with Walk3 and recreate on building really strong annotation. And this time we are also working with Task.ai, who is a professional annotation team. So this is what we're going to do. Then we're planning to run this experiment and publish open science again. And we're really looking to collect more learnings. We're not looking to build a perfect tool. We're looking to collect the learnings and then feed them back into the process of reviewing or consulting it with these new legislations that are keep passing throughout the world. And who knows, in the future, if this research proves to be valuable, for instance, for the Attorney General's department, maybe we will look into finding the right partners to develop it into a software or a tool that they can actually deploy it on their platform.
Wonderful. Okay, well then I will give you back a few minutes of your day and we won't be getting in your way of lunch any longer. I would really like to thank my wonderful panelists for their time and their expertise, and you for your attention. Yeah.